Welcome back, everyone, again to our Center on Asian Democracy series on elections in Asia. My name is Dr. David Buckley. I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville, and also the Interim Director of CAD. As you can see today, joining from a Zoom background as opposed to from my office in Ford Hall, but it's good to be here with you all today. It's very good to be here because we're joined by Dr. Ronald Mendoza to talk about an extremely important upcoming election in one of Asia's largest and most robust, although also most contentious democracies, the Philippines. Dr. Ronald Mendoza is Dean of the Ateneo School of Government at Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Before joining Ateneo, Dr. Mendoza was Associate Professor of Economics at the Asian Institute of Management. He is responsible for various teams of researchers doing research at the intersection of politics and economics. He's done extensive research projects relevant to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. He's worked internationally on questions of governance, democracy, and sustainable and equitable development. Dr. Mendoza worked with an international group of researchers on building inclusive democracies in ASEAN, which won the Outstanding Book Award for 2016 from the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology. So, Ron, first of all, thanks very much for taking the time to be with us and talk about this very important election with us.
It's a pleasure to join you today, Dr. Buckley.
Great, thanks. Maybe we can get started with just a little bit of background on who exactly are the major players in the field as we come up to the May polls. So we have a system in the Philippines that is somewhat fragmented compared to what our American listeners might be accustomed to in a presidential system. So to get us started, could you give us just a quick overview of sort of the major players in the presidential and vice presidential race, and at least as far as we can tell, where things stand as we're now less than a month before Election Day?
Yes, well, there are, we have a system that almost reflects the US system, except we have a few quirks, a few differences. When you elect a president, you don't necessarily also elect the vice president in that tandem. So you can actually break the vote. Our system also is highly dominated by political clans. Essentially, these are powerful families who run for office, have made it their careers to actually be politicians. And, we have done research on thin and fat dynasties. Thin being, they're sort of sequentially occupying position, fat being they're sort of simultaneously occupying positions as a family. And our part of our work looks at the governance implications of that kind of pattern. If you look at the candidates for, it's only about a month's time now for the national elections, which includes the presidential choices. There are some political dynasties running, and they're quite powerful. In fact, the front runner right now is a tandem between two powerful political dynasties, one being the Marcos dynasty and the other being the Duterte dynasty. Marcos, of course, is running for president, and Duterte, Sara Duterte, the daughter of President Duterte, is running for vice president. They're now in the lead as far as the recent polls indicate. There are others who are running who are not necessarily dynastic, and some of us think that they are more likely to be reformist in their orientation. That includes the sitting vice president who is running for president right now. Her name is Leni Robredo. She's not dynastic. She is related to a former politician who actually passed away some time back, Mayor Jesse Robredo. There are a few other candidates, including Isko Moreno, who is a mayor of one of our large cities, Manila, also not dynastic. Senator Ping Lacson, who is a sitting senator, also not dynastic. And then the famous boxing sort of star, Manny Pacquiao, who is also a senator in the Philippines. who has a small dynasty in the making in where he comes from in the south of the Philippines, Sarangani. And these are the main sort of personalities in that presidential race. Unlike the American system, also, there are so many choices to keep in mind for our national elections. So we also get to pick 12 senators out of a really large pool of choices for national senate. They represent the
And it's a
entire
national level poll, just to
exactly
clarify for our viewers, very, very different on that score than the American system. Yeah.
than the American system. Indeed, in fact, there's advocacies right now to sort of create regional representation for stronger representation in the Senate. But until that time, the senators actually run nationwide positions. And there are also congressional posts open, as well as the whole gamut of local government positions: governor, vice governor, mayor, congressman, provincial board member, councilors are all in the ballot. So you can imagine the sort of the amount of information that a typical Filipino voter will need to process in order to make an informed choice. And so therefore, it's not surprising that sometimes it becomes sort of a competition of name recall rather than a competition of policy ideas. So this is generally the situation in the Philippines. Let me put it there for now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Maybe I'll follow up a little bit on that, because obviously you have done, even before the current race where we have famous names like Marcos and Duterte on the ballot, which we'll talk more about. But even before that, you've done research on dynasties for years in the Philippines and their sort of origins and also their consequences. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about, especially the consequences that your research has found that dynasties have for patterns of development. In other words, is this a problem for the quality of democracy in a country? Is this a problem for the quality of development in a country? And if so, why? What kind of obstacles does this pose?
Yes, well, in a nutshell, it is a problem. It is a challenge. In fact, the framers of our present constitution included a clause in that constitution calling for an anti-dynasty law, because they already knew that this was part of the political and development challenge and governance challenge of the Philippines. And the main reason for this is that when you have dynasties, there tends to be a concentration of political power that can undermine checks and balances. So it's that simple. If you have so many individuals from one political clan or just a few political clans occupying the top positions in, let's say, a local government or even in central government these days, you can have a strong amount of control, a strong monopoly of power that can, well, essentially it can slide into impunity, it can slide into corruption, it could slide into any number of behaviors where they can keep on winning without being replaced. So the ability for alternative candidates to compete against them is becoming weaker because of incumbency advantages, because of their control over, the vast infrastructure of government, and also because of risks and threats that they can also pose against alternatives. So there's, in some places in the country, violence, political violence. There are in many places in the country issues of vote buying. So literally, poor and low-income Filipinos being offered money and other things such as jobs and other things that they may want or need in order to gain support, political support. And these are the traditional practices that are associated with many of these political clans. So we did. This is a thing where, as an economist, I'm not a political scientist, so I was.
You're a political economist.
Yeah, these days I think I earned already a new PhD, but from the last decades, worth of work. But otherwise, I was asked what are the implications on development, poverty reduction, and inclusive development of this kind of governance pattern. And what we tried to do was, bring in an interdisciplinary team in order to look at how the pattern is associated with some of the socioeconomic outcomes we as economists try to monitor. And so we put together what is essentially the biggest data set on political dynasties in the Philippines, spanning over 2 decades worth of data, from governor all the way to provincial board member, and then created indices of dynastic concentration in each of the 81 Philippine provinces over those 2 decades. And then we match this with socioeconomic indicators like job creation, poverty reduction, and other things that we're concerned about for inclusive development. And we found that the greater concentration of political power, as indicated by the growth of political dynasties, particularly fat dynasties, those dynasties that run together simultaneously, uh, that is associated with deeper underdevelopment and worsening poverty. So this to us is, in a nutshell, the kind of political inequality. So a lot of poor and low income Filipinos without real political empowerment, because it's all concentrated in a few families, is being mirrored in the economic inequality, because they have no intention of letting go of their position and implementing deep reforms. And so what we have is a chronic inequality pattern in our development, where there's only parts of the country that are growing, and then a large part of the country that is being left behind.
Yeah, well, thanks. That the phenomenon of dynasties is one that there's been some evidence is maybe even growing here in the United States. So, it's a topic that is of broad importance, right? Not just there in the Philippines. I'm wondering maybe if we could talk in a little more detail about one of those dynasties, or sort of an emerging dynasty, the Duterte family, and its role on the campaign trail this time around. So, many of our viewers are probably, or listeners are probably, at least anecdotally familiar with the fact that current President Duterte in the Philippines has been probably most known, at least internationally, for prosecuting a bloody war on drugs, as he calls it, since coming into office, and even going back to his long time status as mayor. This is an approach that has garnered international criticism for human rights violations, while also being coupled with broad popularity, as far as survey evidence tells us. He is not on the ballot because he's term limited, but his name is on the ballot, at least on the vice presidential ballot. As a first question, I'm actually curious, is the war on drugs really figuring in on the campaign trail? Is this still something that's being talked about by the leading candidates? Are there questions from some candidates about consequences for the war on drugs after the fact, or are there still sort of enthusiastic sort of advocacies for carrying this policy forward, or is it not as prominent now that he himself is not on the ballot?
I think it's the latter. It's not as prominent as before, but it is still being raised from time to time. In fact, at least one of the candidates, or I should say several of the candidates, mentioned that they intend to continue this war on drugs, but they want to recalibrate it in the sense that they don't want as many Filipinos killed. They want to go to the source. Basically, a lot of our drugs here are not manufactured in the Philippines. They are actually smuggled into the country. So part of the solutions would be to really address the source, rather than keep on a very bloody, a very punitive anti-drugs campaign that only focuses on the demand side, or on the use. And on that sense, it has been focused on very small users without making a dent on the bigger picture, which is why the war on drugs of President Duterte is largely seen as a failure by many experts who look at the track record and who look at the data. However, it is still, I believe, a popular policy here in the Philippines, in the sense of emphasizing the importance of going after drugs and stopping this, what has been considered a menace to society. So some of the candidates who are, I believe, courting Duterte supporters, and the president still enjoys quite a bit of popular support here. He is a populist. um, So they're trying to signal continuation of some of the policies, and this particular policy, even if it's very very controversial, uh, at least based on those surveys, still indicate that many people still support it.
Yeah, unlike our populists here in the United States, your populist is actually popular, right? It's one because sometimes people draw the Trump Duterte comparison, and I say, look, we can talk something about that, but the truth is that his approval ratings, Trump would die for Duterte's approval ratings, right? He would be the happiest man in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, well, the when I say it's popular, it's based on survey and approval ratings, but we're also the group that generated research on the impact of disinformation on
Sure.
approval ratings, and the impact of fear, or possible impact of fear, at least on herd behavior
Yeah, on survey
and other
response. Yeah.
patterns related to surveys.
Yeah, maybe since you bring up disinformation, maybe I can jump to that topic because, again, something that our American listeners will be very familiar with, but has also really been a prominent challenge in the Philippines, at least going back to Duterte's campaign for the presidency a few years ago. I mean, and I think has deepened since then. The sort of professionalization of especially online sources of disinformation. Can you just tell us a little bit about how disinformation has plays a political role in Philippine politics, about the role of kind of paid trolls and sort of organized disinformation in politics there? What kind of challenge it poses, and then if you know of any, what are the sort of strategies for different civil society actors or good governance groups to adapt to this new set of challenges?
Well, if you recall, a high-level Facebook manager called the Philippines patient zero, as far as the use and weaponization of disinformation.
And
In
Facebook is the predominant social media network in the Philippines, but again, slightly
Yes,
maybe different than in the American context.
yes, yes. So we're one of the big Facebook users in the world. Filipinos love Facebook, and it's become a dominant sort of way of getting news, getting information, staying in touch with contacts, and being part of broad networks, political and otherwise. And again, we're considered in the literature and by the words of that organization itself, one of the main uh, places where it started. This use of disinformation in a political way, and it can be used in various ways. So you asked how exactly can it impact on our political life. Um, Disinformation can actually weaken the amount of empowerment that a citizen may have, because when that citizen makes choices, it is based on what ideally will be good information, so that the choice will be closer to the best informed choice for the citizen, right? That's at least in theory, that's what we're gunning for. So you have schools, you have academic institutions, you even have government trying to provide, and the candidates provide information to citizens who then hopefully make an informed choice that would then result in hopefully the best good for the country. No, that relationship and that dynamic is now being broken down in very important ways through the use of disinformation. Some of it is called malinformation, and as I understand, is just inadvertently sharing something that is not necessarily true, and can mislead. But others are deliberate disinformation, so that they are designed to attack, to destroy reputations, to mislead groups, and anything as deplorable as deep fakes, fake sex tapes.
Yeah,
uh,
even just recently. Yeah, right. Yeah.
exactly, and the fake statements, you know, to destroy reputations of those who are advancing reforms, right? On the other hand, those who are thieves and corrupt people who have been proven to be corrupt in court, and in traditional media, sort of sharing what is basically widely known as already prosecuted cases against these people. They are trying to twist that in order to convince people that they are not actually corrupt, that those are actually that they're just the victims of these experts judging, making a judgment on them, and sort of depriving the people of a better choice, which is in fact farthest from the truth because of their track record. So they're able to twist the truth, and then in their favor if they're corrupt, or against the reformists if they're trying to destroy the reputation of reformists. And so I think I heard this statement stated by one of the US strategists, or the American strategists working for one of your politicians there, who said, if you flood the zone with trash, then citizens will not be able to tell what is the truth and what is trash. And this appears to be the challenge now in the Philippines, because even as we're mobilizing fact checkers, we're mobilizing academics like myself to speak the truth and to try and share it. Traditional media is trying to partner with the different institutions to spread what is good data, that truth. It's still an environment that is full of trash and full of disinformation. And by the time you're trying to correct it, they've already infected, like a disease, so many Filipinos who tend to believe in it, number one, or at least you planted the seeds of doubt, that they begin to doubt the traditional sources, the experts, the people who used to protect them from the trash.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's the deeper damage.
Yeah. One sort of particular area where there've been sort of debates about what is settled fact or what is up for reinterpretation relates to one of the other dynasties that's on the ballot, at the top of the ballot, the Marcos family. You mentioned at the top, of course, that Bongbong Marcos is one of the leading candidates for the presidency, and that's a name that some of our viewers will probably remember is associated with an earlier period of martial law and authoritarianism in the Philippines that ended in the mid-'80s. It's that period, that history actually of the martial law period, that now is being re-litigated, redebated, and questioned by some. You recently wrote a great piece in The Diplomat about what you called a false nostalgia for authoritarianism in the country. Can you just briefly sort of elaborate on what you mean by false nostalgia, and why that false nostalgia may have taken root at this sort of point in the Philippines' development?
Yes, thanks. That is my attempt actually to try and interpret why the present crop of voters is so vulnerable to a a historical revisionism attempt right now taking place, or it has been taking place for a long time. And there is a reframing of that entire martial law experience under President Marcos, the father, and calling it the golden years of our economy, the golden years of our country, and trying to evoke, a sense of nostalgia to bring back the greatness of the country. And that president was famous for basically trying to frame the cultural, political, and economic landscape as a new society, a society where he would make the nation great again. This was his famous claim when he ran for office and won as president. And of course, it is a very alluring and seductive message for many voters that back then and even now. When you listen to it, and the backdrop is so many challenges: the pandemic, our economic inequality, the continued challenge of rising food and oil prices, and all that. So it's that sort of revisionism that is being spread in social media. And I want to mention that there is a big and growing chunk of the voting population that did not experience the martial law years. I myself am considered a martial law baby because I was born under President Marcos's martial law. My mom and dad were literally stopped on the street by police when they were on the way to the hospital to have me. That was the situation back then. You can't go out when it's already curfew, no? And I experienced it. I was there during the EDSA revolution when the dictator was kicked out. I experienced the economic recession that followed, and the long and difficult rebuilding of institutions that took place for the better part of over 2 decades since 1986. This was not a fun time for the Philippines, no, obviously paying down the debt that the dictator left behind and making those tough choices to recover the economy and to build back those institutions. And it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, because it's full of people who were appointed, who were corrupt, and who needed to be replaced over time slowly. So you can imagine that that entire experience, that someone who was born after the Marcos martial law years would then be looking at these 2 to 3 decades, and they would be saying, well, this is not exactly a nice period either, that this is and they would be more familiar with this very noisy, very difficult period of paying back the debt. The Marcos martial law period ended with a big recession and big crisis. But during the beginning of this thing, they were actually living large, building infrastructure, spending left and right, building a nuclear power plant, purchased, by the way, from the Americans, uh, that, did, that did not generate a single watt of nuclear power. Meanwhile, we, when the dictator is kicked out, we go on rolling blackouts because, we cannot trust to operate a nuclear power plant whose main proponent was a corrupt person and disappeared after the EDSA revolution. So I wrote a paper on that nuclear power plant, by the way, for those of you who are interested to learn more about it. But it was one of these large projects funded by development financing and added to our debt, but did not add to our competitiveness and did not add to our capability to promote inclusive development in the Philippines. And yet we had to we had to pay for it. And This was obviously way before the time when Argentina was among the first countries who said, "I'm not going to pay for a dictator's debt." And you know, that's sort of that kind of practice is still quite controversial as far as international development finance is concerned. But you can imagine that the difficult period of rebuilding is what these young voters are more familiar with. The revisionist framing of the Marcos martial law years, when they could obviously look at many infrastructure projects that were being built. What they don't emphasize is the large and unsustainable debt that actually left behind. So when the party ended, it was an economic crisis. And then we figured out, well, a whole bunch of the resources were actually just sucked out from kickbacks and leakages, and not necessarily leaving behind really good infrastructure. So I think that's the tension right now as far as the revisionism of that period, the um, the memory of the difficult times that took place in the last 2 or 3 decades, and then the very mixed information that a young person may have access to when you're looking at the Marcos martial law years.
Yeah, no, that's great to have that context for that. I know we're coming up on time here, and I want to thank you for taking so much time. Maybe we could wrap up. We don't have to end on an optimistic note, but there is in the Philippines a proud tradition, right, of civil society activism, of vibrant free press, of peaceful transition from authoritarianism to democracy, or at least more or less peaceful, in that period in the 80s. There is still, some sort of large scale mobilization around, for instance, domestic election monitoring, right? The Philippines was a pioneer in domestic citizen election monitoring with networks like NAMFREL and today PPCRV, well, both today. And so I'd be curious for your thoughts on the state of kind of civil society and public engagement these days, especially as there's a new generation of kind of younger Filipinos who have come of age in that post-people power era. How would you assess it? How would you compare it to that earlier period? And what do you see as the potential for that kind of citizen mobilization to serve as one of the strengths of democracy moving forward in the country?
Well, I think that's actually the more optimistic note that we can make as far as Philippine democracy is concerned. Those groups are actually now mobilizing a lot of young people who are becoming more aware of the political and economic and governance challenges we face. In fact, they're called woke. That's the term that we use here when these young people realize that they must engage, that they must, engage in volunteerism, engage in these democratic processes, and help strengthen this group of institutions that have played a big role in our democracy, not just during the Marcos martial law years, but during the past 2 or 3 decades when we're trying to rebuild. It faced a lot of tension, I'll admit, in the past 6 years because of the populist wave and the chilling effect on many Filipinos of some of the policies that were rolled out, including the anti-drugs campaign. So for a long time, it was very, very risky, very, very scary to engage in this kind of activity. But now I think during the election period, and now that citizens realize that this is a chance for their empowerment again, when they are being courted by the very same politicians who were sort of imposing these very ineffective and very repressive policies. I believe that this is what we're seeing right now as well in terms of increased volunteerism by many young people. The thing that we're also seeing so far in the election period is that there is an effort, it seems, an emerging effort by many citizens to fight fake news through house-to-house and face-to-face conversations, through decentralized volunteering for certain reformist candidates, not for all. Not all of the candidates are sort of pursuing this. And the objective is to really connect after 2 years of being in more or less a severe lockdown, being disconnected, but just being subjected to a lot of the disinformation online, which I think exacerbated that disinformation. Lockdown plus disinformation is like, in my view, a mind conditioning of epic proportions.
Mm-hmm,
So you need to overcome that, and many of us believe that the best way to overcome fake news and disinformation is really to just talk to another human being, engage, listen, discern, and sort of recover that discourse that we lost in this inequality, in this polarization. Make an impact, be a surrogate for the candidate, the reformist that you want to win. And many citizens are now engaging in this. So beyond volunteering for NAMFREL and PPCRV, NAMFREL, by the way, is our partner right now in a project that we're running. It's called Participate. Beyond those types of activities, there are also many, many decentralized activities right now of volunteers, of certain reformist politicians, trying to engage and trying to undo what we believe has been the conditioning of disinformation that has taken place. So I think that's quite optimistic. I'm not sure there's enough time, but citizens are certainly putting up a fight and trying to make an impact.
Yeah. Well, and these are a set of challenges related to disinformation, polarization, institutional weakness that are facing a lot of democracies, both in the region but also around the world, including here in the U.S. And so it's important also to hold up those movements and those organizations that are trying to organize for a positive pattern of public engagement in the face of all of the challenges. Thanks so much, Dean Ron. It's been great to have you here to share with us. I could talk to you for hours, but it's late here and it's early there. You need to get into your day, and I need to get to the end of mine. So thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Dave. And so your viewers know, Dave is also a very strong and excellent partner of ours in our research. So thank you very much for that partnership.
Well,
Dave.
it's been a pleasure to work with you, Ron, and a real honor, to be honest, with all the hard work that your teams have done. So thanks very much. And for those watching, we will be continuing, as we have been doing recently at CAD, to upload videos and research briefings on elections and the stability of democracy across Asia. So look for more of those via our website and or social media coming up before too long. Thanks so much.